Im yesh mikveh, yesh tikveh. As long as there is mikveh, or if there is mikveh, there is tikveh, there is hope. So it's mikveh. It's part of the procedure of purifying ourselves from ritual impurity, meaning there's always a path, right? No matter how threatening, how scary, how low we may believe we've sunk, there is always hope. God has given us a path to improve ourselves, to lift ourselves. And since God gave us that path, he's assuring us that there's always a hope. There's always hope. What a beautiful thought from Joey Newcomb. His song, Im yesh mikveh, yesh tikveh, from his new album, Big Avoidus. Let's light up the darkness. Have you heard the shofar today? You're gonna. It's Elul. 18 days to go until Rosh Hashanah. And who's with us on a Thursday evening? Bill in Mid-Missouri, Yehudit. In South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck. Guy in Ohio, Renee, Indiana, Sharon. In New Jersey, James in Indianapolis. Gwen in Michigan. Clarissa in Mexico City. Bella in Florida. Sandy in Michigan. Michelle in Washington State. Stephen in New Hampshire. Karen in Northern California. Nancy in North Carolina. Paul in the Great Northwest. Belle in Arizona. This is Paula says, I told your joke to my hubby about the man with his books. I think I messed up the end. If you don't mess up the joke a little, you didn't even tell it. We always mess up the jokes. Then Nina always lets me hear it when I mess up the jokes because I'm supposed to transmit them correctly. She's right. Meg in Vancouver. Ruth in Kentucky. Over on the YouTube side, Aoife checking in from Florida. Welcome, everybody. All right. We're very close to the end of chapter 5, the penultimate page. This is Daf Samech Dalet, page 64, here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of marriage contracts. We're in chapter 5, today concluding our discussion of Mishnah number 6 and opening Mishnah number 7. So Mishnah number 6 was about a wife who rebels or a husband who rebels. We saw that there was a machloket, there was a dispute about what does it mean to rebel. The more accepted opinion means that the wife or the husband refuses to provide conjugal relations to the spouse. So then it's not much of a marriage. And the spouse that is in a state of rebellion gets penalized according to the marriage contract, because one of the obligations under the marriage contract is to provide conjugal relations with your spouse. So if the wife is rebelling and saying, I will not, right? Even if it's not relevant that day because it's her menses, in which case they wouldn't be making love anyway, or they're apart. They're not even actually married yet. They're just betrothed, or she's a wife, a widow awaiting her yavam, right? The brother-in-law under the laws of Yibum. In all these cases, it wouldn't be ripe, as it were, yet for them to have conjugal relations. But if she has said, I won't do it, or he has said, I won't do it, then they become the rebellious spouse and they get penalized financially, meaning that her marriage settlement, right, if they get divorced or he dies and he owes her money under the ketubah, so that amount gets reduced if she is the rebellious one by a certain amount every day, or the amount gets increased by a certain amount every day if the husband is the one who is rebelling. That's according to the Mishnah, but then as we saw, the sages of the Mishnaic period, but not in this Mishnah, later revised the Mishnah, and it's not so much that they have this daily penalty, but rather that they're going to actually publicize that one of the spouses in this marriage is rebelling against the other, and they're, kind of like make it a public embarrassment to convince them to come back into the marriage. And then after 4 weeks of these kinds of warnings, then they just lose. If the wife is the rebelling one, then she just loses the marriage settlement altogether. Now, they make a distinction, as we saw, between a wife who's just disgusted by her husband. Okay, so then there's no hope for this marriage, and we don't do this. We just give her the divorce. Versus a wife who's furious with her husband and would rather stay in the marriage and cause him anguish by rebelling against him, as it were. That's a situation where there actually is hope for the marriage, right? So as we've seen in other contexts, the opposite of love, is not hate, is not anger, right? When you have a strong emotion, you could be close to love. The opposite of love is more indifference or even disgust, as we've seen. Okay, we pick this up on 64a, a few lines from the top. So Rav Tuvi Bar Kizna said that Shmuel said, the court writes a letter of rebellion about a betrothed woman. Right, so this is a woman, so according to one opinion, Rabbi Yosef says, no, rebellion means she refuses to perform the tasks that a wife is obligated to perform for her husband. Like, spinning a thread from wool, cooking the meals, nursing his child, etc. But I think it was Rabbi Meir who said, no. Rebelling means she's not providing marital relations. She's not participating in marital relations with her husband. Refuses to. Okay, so if that's the situation, so Rav Tuvi Bar Kizna said that Shmuel said, the court writes a letter of rebellion about a betrothed woman. Now, you would think this would only come up once they're actually married. If they're betrothed, they're not even living together yet. It's not, they wouldn't be making love. She's still living in her father's house or in her own house because they're only betrothed, not yet married. But if she has expressed, I refuse, I rebel, I don't want this man, in order to cause him anguish. So that's why we have this teaching that comes up a few times, that one with bread in his basket is not like one without bread in his basket, right? Where even though they're not permitted to each other yet because they're only betrothed or because she is ill or because she's menstruating, the fact that, he knows that they have love together and that when that, sort of that external obstacle to them making love is removed, emotionally they'll come together. But if she has said, no, I don't want you, then when the external obstacle is removed, she still won't want him. And that's why this is considered to be in rebellion. So that's why it applies to a betrothed woman as well as a married woman. Right? So Rav Tuvi Bar Kizna said that Shmuel said, about a betrothed woman, we write a letter of rebellion. And this letter is a court order to deduct value from the marriage contract. But the court does not write a letter of rebellion about a widow awaiting her yavam, right? So she was married to a man who died without having children and who leaves a brother. So the brother has the levirate obligation to marry the widow, and their first child will be the heir of the brother that died childless. Or the widow and the brother-in-law can perform chalitza, as we learned in Tractate Yevamos, a ceremony where they release each other from this obligation and they're free to marry other people. But until they either get married or perform chalitza, they have this obligation to each other, this bond together, and she can't go marry someone else, right? So is a widow awaiting yibum, or right, a widow awaiting her yavam, right, the brother-in-law, who says, I will not sleep with this man. Like, you'd think it's premature, but they're in a situation where they're either going to get married or perform chalitza. So when she's saying, I will not sleep with him, you would think, well, why would this apply? Chalitza is an option. They're never going to have to sleep together if they're performing chalitza. So they're going to examine this question. Well, then it doesn't apply, right? So according to Shmuel, the court writes the letter of rebellion for the betrothed woman, but it does not write a letter of rebellion about a widow who's awaiting her yavam. And the Gemara objects to this from a baraisa. The baraisa said, it is the same to me if she is a betrothed woman or a married woman, even if she is a menstruating woman, or even if she is ill, and even if she is a widow awaiting her yavam. So you would think, well, maybe the court does write that letter of rebellion. So the Gemara answers, La kasha, this is not difficult. as the contradiction can be resolved in the following way. Here, where there is a distinction between a betrothed woman and a widow awaiting her yavam, it refers to a case where he asked to marry her and she is refusing. There, where there is no such distinction, the case is where she asked to marry him and he is refusing, right? She wants to go through with the yibum and he refuses. So as Rav Tachalifa bar Avimi said, that Shmuel said, if he asked, the court responds to his request and gives her the status of a rebellious woman. But if she asked, it does not respond to her request and does not add to her marriage contract. Now the Gemara inquires, in what manner did you establish that which Shmuel said, that one writes a letter of rebellion about a betrothed woman but not about a widow awaiting her yavam? What are the circumstances? If it is a situation where the widow says, I want to marry my yavam, the brother-in-law, and he said, no, I don't want to do it, then why phrase this, the court writes a letter of rebellion about a betrothed woman, which indicates that the bill is written against her. She wants to. Obviously, she's not the one rebelling. It should have said instead, write a letter of rebellion for a betrothed woman, meaning it is written on her behalf because her yavam does not want to go through with the yibum. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult as the text is imprecise. Teach the statement instead this way, for a betrothed woman, where it makes more sense that if he's the one who's unwilling, we might write that he is the one in rebellion. Now, as we're reading this, we're thinking, well, why is it rebellion in either case if it's yibum, since they have the chalitza option? And as we'll see, in sort of earlier in Jewish history, yibum was vastly preferred over chalitza. It would be better that she marries her brother-in-law than that she doesn't. So we're going to encourage them to get married. But later in Jewish history, it was determined that, you know what, people are not, if they're doing that, they're not doing it with the right intention, which is not that they should be attracted to each other, but it's really just to create an heir for the brother that died for the sake of the mitzvah. And if they're doing it with any kind of amorous desire for each other, it actually undermines the idea of doing this for the sake of the mitzvah. And therefore, we're going to say, okay, yibum might be permitted. It really hasn't been in centuries. But even when it was permitted, after that turn in Jewish history, like a few thousand years ago, it was determined better that chalitza is preferable. In the beginning, yibum was preferable to chalitza. Later, chalitza was preferable to yibum. Now the Gemara asks, what is different about a widow awaiting her yavam for whom a letter of rebellion is not written against her husband? So you just said, so if she doesn't want to perform yibum, when yibum was preferable, we write a letter of rebellion that she should do it. But if he doesn't want to, we don't write the letter of rebellion. So it seems like, usually it's a patriarchal system and things are imbalanced. But in some of the issues we've been talking about, like for instance, if they're married already and he doesn't want to have sex with her, then he is penalized just like she would be penalized if she didn't want to have sex with him. But in the case of the widow awaiting her yavam, if she doesn't want, they call her a rebellious woman. If he doesn't want, they don't call him a rebellious man. So why? What is different about a widow awaiting her yavam, for whom we write the letter of rebellion, but not against her husband if he's the one rebelling? Because we can say to her, go away. Like if he doesn't want to marry and she does, why is this not as big a deal as if he wants to marry and she doesn't? And the reason is because we can say to her, go away. You are not commanded to procreate. Right? A woman is not commanded to have children. A man is. Right? So if this is his opportunity to have children, it's more serious for him that he wants and she doesn't. Therefore, although she cannot get married until they perform chalitza, he cannot be compelled to perform an act that the Torah does not specifically command him to perform. Now the Gemara challenges this answer. Whoa. If this is the reasoning, then in the case of a betrothed woman also, let us say to her, go away, you are not commanded to have children. Rather, in the case where a letter of rebellion is issued, it must be referring to a woman who comes with a claim saying, I want a staff in my hand and a hoe for burial. And what she's saying is, she might not be commanded to have children, but she has a legitimate desire to have children so that somebody will take care of her in her old age. And that is a legitimate complaint for her to make. She wants to have children. She wants to have children. She might not be commanded to have children, but it is, crucial to her security in this world that she have children. So this claim is valid, and therefore the court does issue a letter of rebellion against the husband if he won't step up and either marry her or perform chalitza. So the Gemara asks, so too here, if she is a widow awaiting her yavam who comes with a claim, why shouldn't the court listen to her? So rather, the Gemara retracts the explanation that she asked him to marry her. Instead, say that both this and that are discussing a situation where the Yavam wants to marry her and she rebels. And yet there's two different outcomes. And the question from the Baraisa on Shmuel's statement is not difficult. Here, where the Baraisa said that the court writes a letter of rebellion about the widow awaiting her for her Yavam, that she is being rebellious because she doesn't want to marry him, this is referring to a case where the Yavam asked her to perform chalitza and she refused. And there, Shmuel's statement that the court does not write it is referring to a case where he asked to consummate the levirate marriage. As Rabbi Pedat said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, if the Yavam asked her to perform chalitza and she refused, the court responds to him, right? If he says, all right, let's perform chalitza, and she says, no, I don't want to perform chalitza. Either she just doesn't want to do anything, or she'd rather get married. But he says, let's perform chalitza. So then, and she says no, the court responds to him and calls her a rebel. If he asks to perform levirate marriage with her and she doesn't want to, the court does not respond to him, right? So if he says, let's get married, and she refuses to do it, the court doesn't call her a rebel and order her to marry him. But if he says, let's perform chalitza, and she refuses to do it, the court will call her a rebel. And the Gemara asks, what is different with regard to the request to consummate the levirate marriage, that if a woman refuses, the court does not write a letter of rebellion against her, because we say to him, go and marry another woman. Okay, he's commanded to have children, but especially according to biblical law, he can have more than one wife. So even if he has a yibum obligation with his brother's widow, that doesn't stop him from marrying a different woman and having children with her. So why should we call this woman, the widow, his Yavama, why should we call her a rebel? It's not necessary. Rather, it must be that the reason is because he says, go and marry another woman. He's not required to marry her specifically if she does not agree to the marriage. Therefore, her refusal is not a rebellion. Now, the Gemara challenges that answer. Well, if so, with regard to a request to perform chalitza, also let us say to him, go and marry another woman. He wants to perform chalitza with his widow. Whether they do or not doesn't stop him from going and marrying another woman. Why is it if he wants to perform chalitza and she doesn't, that we'll call her a rebellious woman? We must be understanding it wrong. So rather, it must be that the reason is because he says, since she is attached to me, they will not give me another wife, right? So as long as he has this yibum obligation with his brother's widow, and it's unclear whether they're going to get married or perform chalitza, they're still in that, indeterminate stage where they just have the yibum obligation, but they haven't gone to either chalitza or yibum. And so that's not going anywhere. So he says, all right, well, I'll marry someone else. But he's going to have trouble finding a wife when that wife hears that he has an unsettled yibum obligation to his brother's widow. This woman who's going to marry him doesn't know whether there's going to be a second wife in the equation or not. And so it's definitely going to interfere with his ability to find a wife and potential mother for his children. As long as he has not performed chalitza, he may have a problem finding another wife as a potential wife. Will be concerned that he has a woman attached to him and may eventually enter levirate marriage with him. This is a valid claim, and therefore the court writes a letter of rebellion against her if she refuses chalitza. So the Gemara asks, okay, so if so, here too, when she refuses a request to consummate the levirate marriage, he may say, well, since she is attached to me, they will not give me another. No other wife will marry me. So why then doesn't the court write a letter of rebellion in that case, where he says, okay, let's get married, and she says no? But we don't call her a rebel in that case. So rather, one must say that this and that are both discussing a case where he asked to consummate the levirate marriage, And in one case, they write the letter of rebellion about his Yavam, and in one case, they don't. And what is the difference? La Kash, it is not difficult. Here in Shmuel's statement, where the court writes the letter of rebellion, it is in accordance with the first Mishnah. And there in the Baraisa, where it doesn't write one, it is in accordance with the ultimate version of the Mishnah. As we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Bechoros, page 13a, the mitzvah, the commandment of Yibum, precedes the mitzvah of chalitza, right? As we learned, originally it was preferable that the couple, the Yavam and the Yavama should perform Yibum, than that they should perform chalitza. This law originally applied when people would intend to perform the levirate marriage for the sake of the mitzvah. At that time, it was customary to compel a woman to enter levirate marriage. And if she refused, the court wrote a letter of rebellion about her. However, now that and so she could still have that option, by the way. Even back then, when the court was trying to compel her to enter Yibum, she still had that option. It's just that she might lose the ketubah payment from her original husband, which is a big penalty. But after a while, they stopped doing that. However, now that people do not intend to enter levirate marriage for the sake of the mitzvah, but they may have other intentions, amorous intentions, so the sages said the mitzvah of chalitza is prioritized over the mitzvah of yibum, over the mitzvah of levirate marriage. So Shmuel's statement that the court does not write a letter of rebellion about a widow awaiting her yavam is in accordance with the ultimate version of the Mishnah. In other words, how the law became and still is, although we don't practice yibum anymore anyway. So the Mishnah asks, until when does he reduce her marriage contract? Now, just the general case of a wife, let's say, who is a rebellious woman, and they're going to reduce the amount of her ketubah as long as she remains in rebellion. And in the context, it states that, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the sums involved are calculated in terapa ikin, and not in dinars, and a terapa ik, right? A terapa ik is half a dinar. It's an interesting word, but it's just, we reduce her ketubah by 1 dinar a day, basically 7 dinars a week. And Rabbi Yehuda says half a dinar a day, 3.5 a week. So Rav Sheshes said, so now the Mishnah, the Gemara asks, what is a terapa ikin? We just said it's half a dinar, but how do we know that? So Rav Sheshes said it's an astera, a small coin. And how much is an astera? A half a dinar. And this is also taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says 3 terapa ikin, which are 9 ma'as, a ma and a half for each day, multiplied by 6 for the 6 days of the week. And Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef said to Shmuel, what is different when she is the one rebelling against him? That we give him compensation for Shabbos, as her marriage contract is reduced by 7 dinars a week, which is 1 dinar per day, including Shabbos. And what is different for her? That if he is the one rebelling, we do not give her compensation for Shabbos, but rather only for 6 days. And the Gemara explains, when it is she who is fined and her marriage contract is reduced, it does not appear to be Shabbos wages, money paid for services rendered on Shabbos, because that's prohibited. And whereas when it is he who is fined and compelled to add additional money every day to her marriage contract, it does appear to be Shabbos wages. So consequently, the sages decreed that he should not give her money for what was lost on Shabbos. Right? We don't want to be in a situation where we're calculating a fine that is sort of, because of an action that you would take, and otherwise the fine is levied, because that feels like wages are paid for this action, and we don't want to ever pay someone for an action taken on Shabbos. It's kind of a little bit of an attenuated connection when we're talking about a spouse's obligation to provide conjugal relations, and as long as they're in rebellion, we're going to fine them every day, but we're not going to fine for Shabbos. Especially because we already learned that Shabbos is the ideal time for a couple to be together. But still, in making these financial calculations, we don't want to tie a fine or payment of money to what transpires on Shabbos. And by the way, the general principle, we don't pay wages for work done on Shabbos, right? Think about a rabbi or a cantor, right? Or somebody or a babysitter who provides childcare services on Shabbos at the synagogue, right? So people who are doing that are making it possible for the community to pray. a rabbi is clearly working on Shabbos, right? And a cantor, I mean, they're leading the prayers. The rabbi maybe is making a sermon every Shabbos. Other people are involved in the work and the life of the shul, of the synagogue, the people providing the childcare services. So are they expected to work for free? Absolutely not. But you just said, Sal, you can't pay people for work that they do on Shabbos. Even if it's not prohibited labor, right? Like reading a sermon out loud, that's not prohibited labor. You can always teach Torah on Shabbos. But, the rabbi is clearly fulfilling the obligations of his career, of his contract, right, with the synagogue when he teaches on Shabbos. So how do we work this out? And the answer is, it is understood that we don't pay the rabbi for the work that he does on Shabbos. We pay him for the work that he does during the week so that he's prepared to teach Torah on Shabbos. What about the babysitter? I mean, clearly the babysitter is working on Shabbos. No, the babysitter is, just attending to the children like any adult could attend to children and make sure they're not harming themselves. What we're paying the babysitter for is the kind of maturing and training and, whatever goes into becoming a competent babysitter, which happened during the week, right? So that's, how different is it? I mean, they're going to get a paycheck for services that were rendered on Shabbos, but really they're getting the paycheck for the learning and preparation they did before Shabbos. Now we're on 64b. And on the same issue, Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef said to Shmuel, what is the reason for the difference in law between a rebellious man and a rebellious woman? According to all opinions, a rebellious wife's fine is greater than that of a rebellious husband. And he said to him, go and learn from the market of prostitutes. Who hires who? Or who hires whom? And what's he saying? Typically, there are male prostitutes in the world, but I think we would all agree that the ratio of, women prostitutes in the world vastly exceeds the number of male prostitutes in the world. Why? Because the typical client of a prostitute is a man and not a woman. And what do we learn from that? Clearly, a man suffers more from lack of sexual intercourse, and therefore the penalty for a rebellious wife is greater. Alternatively, when he desires sexual relations, his inclination is noticeable on the outside, and therefore he feels shame as well as pain. But for her, her inclination is on the inside, so she doesn't have to go through humiliation from the fact that she wants and is not getting the way that a man would. We'll just leave it at that. Now, that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. Here comes Mishnah number 7 of chapter 5, the final Mishnah in the chapter. If someone feeds his wife by means of a third party serving as a trustee, right? So we're getting back to the more general obligations of the spouses in their marriage, not just talking about conjugal relations. So one of the things we saw is a husband is obligated to sustain his wife, to feed her, to clothe her, to shelter her, etc. Now let's get a little bit more granular about this obligation. So if someone feeds his wife by means of a third party, so that for whatever reason, he's away on business, he's in the study hall, he's not home. Well, that doesn't mean that she's now left to fend for herself. He still is obligated to sustain her. So let's say he's sending his agent to bring her what she needs. So if he feeds his wife by means of a third party who's serving as a trustee, while the husband himself is not living with her for some reason, he may not give her less than 2 kav of wheat or 4 kav of barley a week for her sustenance. And Rabbi Yosei said only Rabbi Yishmael, who was near Edom, allotted her barley. And he must give her half a kav of legumes and half a log of oil and a kav of dried figs, or the weight of a maneh of fig cakes. And if he does not have these fruits, he must apportion for her a corresponding amount of fruit from elsewhere. He can't just send her a bag of flour, right? He's got to send her a nice full bag of groceries that meets all her different dietary needs. And he must give her a bed, a soft mat, and a hard mat. And he must give her a cap for her head and a belt for her waist and new shoes from festival to festival, right? So there are 3 festivals every year, right? Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Apparently, maybe this means 3 times a year she has to get a new pair of shoes. Or maybe it just means from, let's say, Passover to Passover, or, Sukkot to Sukkot, at least once a year he has to provide new shoes. Or maybe it means every festival, right? So 3 times a year. And he must purchase garments for her with a value of 50 dinars from year to year. Now let's remember that a widow goes into a marriage with a minimum marriage contract of 100 dinars and a virgin with 200 dinars. And that's considered a substantial amount of money that's going to give a husband pause before, just because he gets angry, he decides to divorce his wife. That's why they made that minimum amount of the ketubah. So that was meant to be like a big amount of money. 200 dinars is like a year's salary for the average worker in Talmudic times. 200. So 1/4 of the average yearly salary of a working class man is what he has to give his wife every year so she can purchase new clothing. 50 dinars from year to year. And the Mishna comments, and he may not give her new clothes, which tend to be thick. He may not give her new clothes, which tend to be thick and warm in the summer, nor worn garments in the rainy season, as these are too thin and she will be cold. Rather, he should give her clothes at a value of 50 dinars in the rainy season, when they're still thick and new, and she covers herself with these same worn garments in the summer as well, when they've worn down a little bit and they're going to be lighter, which makes sense for the summer in Israel. And the leftover worn clothes belong to her. And we kind of think about clothing, we live in a modern consumerist society where even like very poor people have closets with a lot of clothes in them. But in ancient times, you basically wore the same garment all the time unless you were really rich. So it's like once a year she would get a new set of clothes and pretty much wear it until it was worn out a year later, and then she gets something new. Now the worn clothes, at the end of the year, she can keep those to kind of, her closet collection starts getting a little bigger. But, if it's really one proper set of clothing that gets washed a lot, and the washing was rough, right? They didn't have washing machines. It was like, really rubbing those things by hand, which wore down the clothing. Now, in addition to the above, he must give her another silver a silver coin for the rest of her needs, right? So in addition to providing for all her needs, as was just listed, he also gives her money so that she can, have money to do what she wants. And she eats with him from Shabbos evening to Shabbos evening. So at least once a week they do have to eat together. Although he may provide for her sustenance via a third party throughout the week, on Shabbos evening, Friday night, she has the right to eat together with him. And if he does not give her a silver coin for her needs, then his earnings belong to her. She can take from his earnings. And what is the fixed amount that she must earn for him? Okay, so that's his obligation to her. What about her obligation to him outside of conjugal relations? What is the fixed amount that she must earn for him? We saw this already. She must spin wool in the weight of 5 selah of threads of the warp in Judea, which are equivalent to 10 selah according to the measurements of the Galilee, or the weight of 10 selah of the threads of the woof, which are easier to prepare in Judea, which are equivalent to 20 selah according to the measurements used in the Galilee. And if she is nursing at the time, the required amount is reduced from her earnings and is added to the sum she receives for her sustenance. In what case is this statement, i.e. all these amounts and measurements, in what case are all these measurements said? With regard to the poorest of Jews. This is an absolute minimum. If you're super poor, don't get married unless you can provide everything on this list. However, in the case of a financially prominent man, all of the amounts are increased according to his prominence. So it's not that a man who's well off can provide for his wife according to what the poorest, worker is giving to his wife. A man who has means has to provide for his wife in the same manner as he provides for himself. Now the Gemara. Whose opinion is expressed in this Mishnah, number 7? It is not Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, And it is not Rabbi Shimon, as we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Eruvin 82b. What is the measure for a joining of Shabbos boundaries, meaning the Eruv? And as we learned back then, that if you wanted to walk more than 2,000 amos away from your home, in the absence of some kind of citywide Eruv, an enclosure that encloses the whole city, so you can walk anywhere within that city. But if that doesn't exist, you live out in a rural area, so then from your home, you can only walk 2,000 cubits in any direction, a circle with a radius of 2,000 cubits, and the center of that circle is your house. But let's say you want to go have lunch at your buddy's house who lives down the road, and he lives 3,000 cubits down the road. So you can't walk that far on Shabbos. What can you do? You can make an Eruv of joining the boundaries, meaning you're going to deposit a basket of food basically at a point in between your house and your buddy's house. And that's going to be understood to be your Shabbos residence, right? And how much food has to be in that basket? Enough for 2 meals during Shabbos. So that basket kind of becomes a legal device to establish your residence wherever that basket is located. And so you can walk 2,000 cubits from that basket. So let's say it's 1,500 cubits from your house, right? So you can walk 1,500 cubits to the basket, and then another 1,500 cubits beyond the basket, and that will get you to your buddy's house. In other words, the circle is always the same size. 2,000 cubits from your house means a circle, 2,000 cubits in every direction. It means that, from end to end of the circle, the diameter of the circle is 4,000 cubits. What you're moving is the center, so that you're moving the whole circle so that it will include you and your buddy's house, and that's how you can walk to your buddy's house. Why is that relevant here? Because they're going to define, now that a husband is obligated to provide a certain amount of food for his wife every week, they're going to try to figure out, well, how many meals is he providing her, and how do we define what a meal is? And we're going to get that information from the law of the Eruv joining boundaries. So, what is the measure of joining a Shabbos boundaries? It consists of a quantity of food sufficient for 2 meals for each and every one of the people who are included in the Eruv. So the Tanaim disagree with regard to the definition of these 2 meals. It is referring to one's food that he eats on a weekday and not on Shabbos. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says it is referring to the amount he eats on Shabbos, but not on a weekday. And both this sage, Rabbi Meir, and that sage, Rabbi Yehuda, are intending to be lenient with how much food needs to go into that Eruv. Because the food you put in the Eruv, it's wasted. You're not going to actually eat it. You're just using it to establish this moving of the Shabbos boundary. So they're being lenient, so you don't have to put too much food in it. And so Rabbi Meir says, well, we eat less per meal during the week than on Shabbos, so we define the 2 meals as 2 weekday meals. And Rabbi Yehuda says we actually eat less on Shabbos than we do during the week in terms of each meal. I'm not sure why Rabbi Yehuda would say that. And therefore, what goes into the basket will be smaller with that leniency. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, food for 2 meals, what is it? It is the size of a loaf bought with a pundeon, which is 1/48 of a selah, when 4 sa of wheat is sold for a selah. So according to this calculation, a pundeon, this kind of money measure, can purchase 1/12 of a sa of wheat, which is equivalent to half of a kav, as there are 6 kav in a sa. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, 1/4 of a kav is sufficient for a single meal. And Rabbi Shimon says food for 2 meals is 2 of 3 parts of a loaf, when 3 loaves are prepared for a kav of wheat. So according to Rabbi Shimon, therefore, 1/9 of a kav of wheat is sufficient for a meal. Right? So these 2 opinions, one of them says 1/4 kav is a meal, the other says 1/9 of a kav is a meal. And recall that in our Mishnah, the husband is obligated to send his wife, according to, among all the other objects on the food shopping list, 2 kav of wheat, right? So if 1/4 kav is enough for a meal, that would seem like 8 meals, right? If it's 1/9, it would seem like 18 meals. So having discussed the various opinions with regard to the size of a loaf of bread sufficient for a meal, the Mishnah states that half of this loaf is the amount called a peras, a half measure relevant for the law of a leprous house, right? That a house could have tzara'as. So if one enters a house afflicted with tzara'as and remains there long enough to eat this amount of food, the clothes that he is wearing become ritually impure. And half of its half, meaning 1/4 of a loaf of this size, is the amount of ritually impure food that renders the body unfit. In other words, impure food of this amount imparts ritual impurity to the body of the eater and disqualifies him by rabbinic law from eating teruma. If he was a priest who was qualified to eat teruma, but he became tameh, ritually impure, now he's not fit to eat teruma, consecrated food that has to be eaten only in a state of tahara, ritual purity. And half of 1/2 of its half, 1/8 of this loaf, is the minimum measure of food that is susceptible to tuma as food. So, after citing the Mishnah, the Gemara returns to the question, who is the author of the Mishnah here, which says that a husband must provide 2 kav of wheat per week for his wife's sustenance? So if it is Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, who maintains that 1/4 of a kav is sufficient for a single meal, well, there are only 8 meals in 2 kav. And the wife requires at least 14 meals per week, right? An adult needs at least 2 meals a day, as it was customary to eat 2 meals a day back then. There wasn't a third meal. And if it is Rabbi Shimon who holds that 1/9 of a kav is sufficient for a meal, well, then 2 kav are enough for 18 meals. And therefore, the Mishnah requires more than she actually needs for 14 meals. So the Gemara answers, well, actually, the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. And this is, as Rav Hizda said, an explanation of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka's opinion. Deduct 1/3 for the grocer's markup, as he takes 1/3 as profit. And this adds 1/2 to the total cost. So here too, bring 1/3 and add it to the total amount of meals that can be provided by 2 kav of wheat. So the Gemara says, well, still, after adjusting the calculation by adding an additional half, a measurement known by the term outside third. In other words, if you have 10 of something, and you add 5 to it, so now there's 15. So it's like, did you add a third or a half, right? It's a third of the final amount of the 15, and it's a half of the original amount. So when you add half of the original amount and it becomes, a third of the finished amount, this is called an outside third. Where am I? This is called an outside third. Where am I? Lost my place. Sorry. No, 212. Okay. Where's the outside third? I just read that. So he adds a third for the grocer. Anyway, he takes 1/3 as profit. So this adds 1/2 to the total cost. Which is known by the term outside third, to the amount of meals that can be eaten for 2 kav of wheat. So they are equal to 12 meals. So this is still not sufficient. The wife requires 14. So the Gemara answers, yeah, but she eats with him on Shabbos evening. Consequently, 12 meals is enough because 2 of the meals of the weekly meals she eats with her husband in his house. He only has to send her 12 meals. So the Gemara asks, okay, well, this works out well according to the one who says that when the Mishnah is referring to eating, it means literally eating. However, according to the one who says that this is eating on Shabbat, that this eating on Shabbos evening is a euphemism, and it is actually referring to conjugal relations, what can be said? It's not that she's eating with her husband on Shabbos evening, it's that they're going to have conjugal relations. He still has to provide her 14 meals a week. And furthermore, even if the meal on Shabbos evening is omitted, so there are still 13 meals that she requires, but she has only enough for 12. So rather, this is as Rav Hizda said, with regard to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka's opinion, deduct 1/2 for the grocer's markup, and so too bring a half and add it to the total amount, which means she has enough for 16 meals, not 8. So the Gemara says, well, this is difficult with regard to one statement of Rav Hizda, who seemingly contradicts the other statement of Rav Hizda. And the Gemara answers, well, no, this is not difficult. This statement that the grocer's markup adds 1/3 to the price is referring to a place where they also give money as a separate payment for the wood required to bake the bread. And that statement that the grocer's markup adds half is referring to a place where they do not give her money for the wood, and therefore the markup must be higher to cover those costs. So after reconciling the apparent contradictions between the two statements of Rav Hizda, the Gemara returns to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. So if so, according to the above calculation, that there are 16 meals, that's what the husband has to give his wife, 16 meals worth of wheat for her to make bread. So if so, according to the above calculation, there are 16 meals, and that's more than she requires for a week. Why is he providing her more than she needs? And the Gemara suggests, in that case, who is the author of the Mishnah? Is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Hitka, who said that a person is obligated to eat 4 meals on Shabbos? Since 2 meals are eaten on an ordinary weekday, this results in a total of 16 meals a week. I'm very close to done. If you've got questions or comments, get them in. Gemara rejects this suggestion. You can even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who maintain that one is obligated to eat only 3 meals on Shabbos, which is the law, as you should remove 1 meal for guests and wayfarers. In other words, the husband cannot give his wife the absolute minimum amount that she requires for herself and no more. He must give her enough to provide for the occasional visitor. Consequently, the total sum is somewhat more than was originally assumed. So the Gemara adds, and now that you have arrived at this answer, you can even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who maintains that 2 kav is sufficient for 18 meals. And this can be explained either by saying that Rabbi Shimon agrees with the opinion of the rabbis that one eats 3 meals on Shabbos if you remove 3 meals for guests and wayfarers, or that Rabbi Shimon agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Hitka that 4 meals are eaten on Shabbos, in which case you must remove 2 meals for guests and wayfarers. And in this manner, the Mishnah can be reconciled with all opinions. But let us remember, the husband has to send her, more than the bare minimum so that she can eat well, so that she can have an occasional guest. And this is only if he is the poorest of the poor. If he's, middle class, upper class, more prominent than that, he has to sustain her in the same manner that he sustains himself. And if he's some kind of weirdo that, starves himself, doesn't matter. He has to sustain her according to what's normal for a woman of their socioeconomic status. Okay. Let's go to questions and comments. On Kesubos 64. Gwen, what happened when the husband wanted it at 2:30 to 3 a.m. at night? The wife is tired from a full day of work. I think what you're saying is, what if she just says no on a particular instance? It's not that she has to provide sex on demand. That's what, it doesn't mean that a wife is a rebel when she says, not right now. I'm tired, tomorrow, or even next week, right? That's not what it means. It's where she makes the statement, I will not make love to this man. I am furious with him and I will not make love to this man. Period. End of story. Implying that state could go on forever. That's a very different thing than not now, right? Bill, in my religious world, we find, for the priests at least, a similar solution. Strictly speaking, a priest in my church isn't paid a salary at all, but they instead receive a living stipend. And this is also because in my tradition, we have a bad history with the appearance of impropriety around, as it were, pay-for-pray behavior. So the same idea that a rabbi does not receive payment, no part of his salary is received for, inspiring, leading the congregation on Shabbos. He's paid for the work he does during the week, right? Shabbos, he's not technically working. And Sharon, having worked in the traditional Jewish community for years, there are some interesting workarounds, I guess, about this same question, getting paid for Shabbos. So if you worked in a medical field that is not medically critical, they would not pay Jews to work even if they were secular. They could not earn either, so they had a non-Jewish partner who earned on Shabbos or holiday for the business and met expenses, and any additional profits were donated. Exactly. And another place where this comes up, right, is restaurant owners. So if you own a kosher restaurant, basically what you want to be doing is you shut down Friday afternoon and you don't open till late Saturday night, a couple hours probably after Shabbos ended, because you can't do prep work for your restaurant to open until Shabbos ends. And that's why they don't open the restaurant until a few hours after Shabbos ends. But, the restaurant business is very tough. Right? And so there's certain parts of the world and in the parts of the country even now where if you wanted to have a kosher restaurant and it was going to be closed on Shabbos, and you can't serve Jews on Shabbos anyway because you can't have an exchange of money with them. But maybe you could be serving non-Jews during Shabbos, and that would be necessary to the financial life of the restaurant. Otherwise, it would go bankrupt. So what do? So there's certain restaurants that have an arrangement where basically every Friday, the owner sells the restaurant to a non-Jew, and the non-Jew operates the restaurant on Shabbos with non-Jewish workers. And then later, after Shabbos ends, they sell it back. The non-Jew sells it back to his Jewish partner. It's a kind of ongoing arrangement. Machmir Jews and Machmir communities, stringent Jews and stringent communities probably won't go for this arrangement. And often restaurants like this, like their hechsher is not one that all, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews would accept, but some do. Right? Some do, and some have this arrangement, and it used to be much more common in the past than it is now, where sort of the laws of kashrus have actually become more stringent over the years as people become more and more careful. But anyway, that kind of arrangement used to exist in the past and still in some places. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at Friday's regular time, noon Pacific. And with God's help, we'll complete Chapter 5 and Volume 1 of Tractate Kesubos. Here in the Koran, it's divided, this tractate, into 2 volumes, Part A and Part B. And so tomorrow, with God's help, we'll finish the first half of the volume, and we'll start a new book for the second half. So it's approximately, 130-page volume. Have a great night.